Pilots, flight crews of Reddit, what went wrong on your flight that the passengers never knew about? I'm a bush pilot in Canada. I was working the right seat of a turbo otter, my first ever flight in one, so I was still getting used to the setup. We were taking off from a short strip in the middle of nowhere with 6 drillers in the back and a bunch of gear. Captain started the engine as I was just finishing up the passenger briefing. He started rolling down the runway as I was just getting seated. I thought he was just positioning the plane to prepare for takeoff, but then he gave it full throttle. I didn't even have my seatbelt or headset on yet. I'm focusing on getting this stuff on when I realize something isn't right. Getting closer to the end of the strip, Captain starts to panic as we aren't getting airborne. His hands were shaking like mad and he kept reaching for things, but he couldn't figure out what was wrong. I think he was too busy looking at the trees and creek right ahead of us. I realized the problem. He was in such a rush to leave that he didn't do a pre-takeoff check. Propeller was still in full course, feathered on shutdown. It should have been full fine for takeoff. I yelled, gestured to him the problem and immediately pushed the prop forward. Engine had a huge surge and we just barely cleared the trees at the end of the strip. He acted like nothing happened for the rest of the flight. We didn't even speak a single word to each other. I suspect none of the passengers even realized what had happened and how close we were to being another statistic. When we got back to the airport, I told him I was leaving, packed my bags and never looked back. Great example of why checklists and procedure are always so important no matter how good someone thinks they are. Girlfriend is a flight attendant, so I asked her for a few stories. 1. Upon landing, one of the tires blew out. It pretty much just resulted in a bigger jolt than usual, and although a few passengers commented on it, the crew just played it off as a more or less regular landing. Girlfriend, what are you gonna do? Tell everybody a tire just blew and get them all panicked? 2. At least once a week, there's an armed, plainclothes federal air marshal riding on the plane, usually in first class. They're there as a security measure, in case the cockpit is breached or something. Even if people are aware that air marshals are a thing, usually portrayed in Hollywood as escorting a criminal, they don't realize the frequency with which the marshals ride along on planes. 3. A guy on the plane was from a connecting flight from a Eurasian airline, with a boarding pass under some other woman's name. The woman happened to be on the flight as well, so he obviously didn't belong. The guy could have stayed if he had just gone through TSA again, but he refused to go through the process and was very strongly insistent on talking to the captain directly. Big red flag right there. No idea what the real story was. She believes that it was a foiled terrorism attempt, but the crew treated it as a simple duplicate boarding pass problem. Again, the problem was dealt with and you don't want to unnecessarily worry the passengers. 4. A lot of people try to join the Mile High Club. Like, a lot. I wasn't the crew on either, but my service had 2 pretty severe bird strikes within several weeks of each other. One was a hawk of some kind and the second was a duck. The duck strike happened with a patient loaded, evidently just as the pilot was flipping his NVGs up. The duck came through the windscreen and went to smithereens along with all the plexiglass. I helped clean up the back of the helicopter later, and it looked like a duck had swallowed a duck of lit dynamite. The strike also happened at the exact moment the med crew had pushed a medication that relaxes all the muscles in the patient's body including breathing muscles, and in spite of the chaos they continued their procedure and successfully controlled the patient's airway. The pilot also continued the flight in spite of being covered in duck blood, guts, feathers, as well as his own blood from his broken nose. The crew, and the other bird strike crew, received commendations for their calm composure under the circumstances. It's pretty mind-boggling the damage a several pound bird can inflict. It looked like a duck had swallowed a duck of lit dynamite. I don't care if this was a typo. This is what I'm choosing to believe took place. Not a pilot, but one of my buddies is. We were talking about one of the more remote airports that we'd both visited, located in a difficult place that has a lot of wind shear, so passengers are used to having the plane make a couple of attempts when landing. Anyway, my friend said the sensors for the landing gear malfunctioned, so he couldn't tell whether the wheels were down or if they'd gotten stuck. He flew low, made an announcement to the cabin that they needed to circle the runway because of the wind, and made a call to the control tower asking for someone to make a visual confirmation that the landing gear was fully deployed. My dad had a wasp in the cockpit with him once. He said his first thought when he noticed it right after taking off was, oh, so this is how I die. I used to do contract maintenance work on aircraft, and once a bunch of us were returning from a job in Germany. The plane was a scheduled flight on a small, 50-seat or so, turboprop aircraft, and it was a bumpy flight. I am fairly well traveled, and working on aircraft made me more confident than most of flying. But the turbulence started to get so bad that I was getting nervous. Nobody except the flight crew were allowed to unfasten their seat belts, and even they were being thrown about as they tried to move around. It was by far the worst flight I have been on. So anyway, just as things were getting to the peak of shittiness, one of the stewardesses made her way to one of my colleagues sitting across the aisle, and said, in a hushed tone, "Excuse me sir, is it true that you guys are aircraft engineers? We have a slight problem out the back, and thought you might be able to help." I honestly thought we were going to die, that the bumpiness was not down to turbulence, but some flight system had gone AWOL. I didn't know what the frick any of us would be able to do on unfamiliar equipment with no documentation, no spares and no tools. But sure enough, my colleague went off with the stewardess and disappeared through the door out of the cabin. 10 minutes late he was back, and of course we were keen to know what the problem was and if he was able to do anything about it. The problem turned out to be a ratchet strap on one of the cupboard doors in the galley was jammed, so they couldn't get the snacks out. The flight continued to be horrible, and the snacks were predictably crap. As a child, my family and I spent a few days in the Bahamas, and as we were at the outdoor airport single runway we discovered that we were flying an 8-seater single prop plane back to Florida. The first time taxiing down the runway, the pilots discovered something was wrong with the engine, so they pulled off to the side and made us sit next to the plane as they attempted to fix the engine. After being told that the plane was functioning again, we boarded and began to taxi down the runway again. I was watching the pilot and company pilot do their thing when I noticed the airspeed indicator drop to 0 as we were about to lift off. At this point we were running out of runway, and I watched as the co-pilot jabbed the non-working gauge with his palm and the gauge began to work again. The pilots then looked at each other, back at us, then back at each other before laughing. Honestly, a not totally uncommon problem. Sometimes those gauges just get stuck, and a smack can unstuck them. Percussive maintenance sometimes really does work. Dad's a pilot, so I get to hear all of these. Good one that comes to mind you, he flies 737s for a major airline. Getting ready to take off at night, he sees a plane about to land on the taxiway he's waiting on. He immediately just starts turning on every exterior light on the plane. Other plane pulled out of final descent at like 500 feet. Cockroach in the cockpit. Red eye from LAX. One of us was strapped in while the other one hunted for the little sucker. We once brought a pigeon from Newark to Dayton. The little scavenger was hiding in the back eating pretzel crumbs. Just started walking down the aisle about 30 minutes into the flight. He stayed chill and I only had a handful of passengers, so we just let it happen. Shoot him off in Dayton. His family probably misses him. I was flying a Piper Navajo that seats 8 passengers out of a small airport. We were making all of our required radio calls. But because this was a small uncontrolled airport, some people in small airplanes will operate without radios or just don't care enough to broadcast their position. Anyway, we were doing our due diligence, but not long after takeoff and while leaving the traffic pattern, my FO says crap and takes control from me and make a relatively aggressive, for passengers at least, turn to the right. As he does this, I see a Cessna out my left window no more than 150 featuring below us. We essentially climbed through the altitude he was cruising at and turned to avoid him. Only one passenger noticed when we got to the destination and he told us it was a good move. Good times. It was a flight from Kansas to Oregon, and as we were mid-flight, a Hawk fricking dive-bombed the wing and dented it. The pilot announced the subtle thud as minor turbulence, but the crew knew what had happened. No one knew how the heck the Hawk was flying so high. It was a smaller plane, so we only had 1.5 dozen people, not counting us crew members. The dent didn't actually mess with flight too much, but it's a heck of a story to tell. I fly on a Beechcraft 1900. C&D models, varies flight to flight, quite frequently. It's a similar size to what you described. In fact, every once in a while I'll see a bird shoot past my window at insane heights. But yeah, a Hawk saying frick this plane in particular is one heck of a story. Not me but my father. Years ago when Dad was flying the 767 for Air Canada, they were coming out of London Heathrow back to Canada in the winter time and some snow had started to fall. Heathrow 10 years ago was notorious for letting a dusting of snow hamper operations. Dad and crew expedited boarding and pre-flight as much as they could and pulled the brakes and pushed back early to get ahead in the queue for takeoff. They couldn't get a taxi clearance right away as a number of aircraft ahead of them had opted to wait for the heaviest of the snow to pass prior to taking off and the controllers wouldn't move them out of the way. Dad basically begged them to move them ahead somehow, as he had been around the block a time or two and knew what was coming. But to avail, ground had them park the airplane and they sat loaded at the gate for 4 hours before all flights out were cancelled. Over 4 inches of snow. The airport's inability to deal with the snow and backlog of traffic meant that Air Canada couldn't get a plane out for 3 more days, by which time they had brought extra aircraft over from Montreal to try to relieve some of the buildup. So in this story, what the passengers didn't know is that if they were maybe 10 minutes faster boarding the plane, they wouldn't have gotten stuck in London for an extra 3 days. I was giving my sister and a friend a tour of the Chicago skyline over Lake Michigan. We are all having a good time. Suddenly, the engine goes quiet. A nightmare, especially because I only have one of them. The silence was noticeable and my sister looks at me and starts to panic. The engine comes back within about 3 seconds alive and well, and I head for the nearest airport. In a small propeller plane, it is hard to hide the silence of the engine, but since it came back, I acted like nothing happened. I don't think they realize how critical of a situation it almost was. Contrary to popular belief, the propeller's primary function is to keep the pilot cool, because you should see him sweat when it stops. I was asked this question by a passenger while I was experiencing a problem with the rudder brake pedals in the plane I was flying. He basically asked what was the most urgent situation I had encountered while in flight. Little did he know that it was happening in real time at that moment. I had called the tower of my destination airport to report my position and request landing. As I'm going through my checklist, I positioned my feet on the rudder pedals to have authority over the toe brakes to slow the aircraft after landing. As I moved my foot on the right pedal, it sort of flopped forward. What does this mean? A couple potential problems, especially while on approach for landing. With the pedal flopped forward, it meant the top of the pedal would be pushed into the firewall and severely limit right rudder control. Not having bilateral brake control greatly increases the likelihood of a ground loop, or spinning out of control and flipping the plane over or off the runway. I narrated the problem to my passenger as I acted out the physical inspection to try to solve the problem. I reached down with my hand and flipped the pedal back up so that it was at least in the right position. Apparently the linkage for the right brake had become disconnected. I knew that if I put the plane on the numbers, I had almost 5,000 feet to roll out and clear the runway for the next aircraft. I made an uneventful landing and just rolled with light left brake and some counter steering to keep the plane under control while it naturally slowed. The controller asked me to expedite clearing the runway and I replied that I would, but I still rolled until I could just steer naturally off the runway. The passenger had no idea that I was encountering my first significant mechanical failure. I was just over 100 hours of flight time and working at a flight school as a dispatcher and front office person on Sundays. My passenger was someone that one of our clients had dropped off at another airport and was unable to pick him up. I told the guy I'd come get him after my shift if he'd cover half the rate of the plane of my choice. I was extremely familiar with the aircraft I chose, but a cotter key failed and allowed the brake linkage to disconnect. Everyone lived. As a kid, 8-9, I flew in a small plane with my Air Force dad and his friend. We lived in Minot, ND, big base there, and were flying sometime in winter. Later I learned we had such a long joy flight that day because the landing gear froze up, and we were flying around trying to get them to come down. As we were almost out of fuel, they were planning to crash land on the frozen river, when in the nick of time the landing gear unfroze and deployed. I had no idea though. It was beautiful flying above a winter wonderland. My brother was first stationed there. That place is a whole lot of nothing filled with a whole bunch of snow for a lot of the year, haha. You've been visited by the banana guardian. He will protect you and all of your bananas, but only if you comment "protect us mighty doggo." If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video, or don't. Either way, have a great day, you magnificent people.